Scenes and Adventures in the Semi-Alpine region of the Ozark Mountains of Missouri and Arkansas, 1853, by Henry Rowe, Schoolcraft. Chapter 14, Part 1, Number 26. I determined to quit the river at this point, and after a night's rest made the necessary arrangements. There is almost a moral certainty that De Soto must have crossed the river above this place. The make of the land and the custom of the Indians in choosing the best ground for a path to travel from village to village would determine this. His position, after crossing the Mississippi at the mouth of the St. Francis and reaching the high grounds of the latter, would lead the natives who were his guides to keep the elevated and dry ranges leading to the buffalo country west, and he must have crossed the affluence of the Black and Current rivers at a high point towards the Ozarks. The dry and open woods afforded the best ground for the march of his cavalry, and when he attempted to reach the Salt and Buffalo country from the region east of White River, the roughness of the country would lead him to the central points of that stream. It would be interesting, as a point of antiquarian interest, to know where the old Indian paths were located. The roads in all parts of the country were based on these. They led to the most practicable fords of rivers. They avoided swamps and boggy grounds, and evinced a thorough geographical knowledge of the conformation of the country. To travel where De Soto had traveled, and where he had performed some of his heroic feats, had something pleasing at least in the association. Doubtless, had the first occupants of Upper Louisiana been as mindful of historical reminiscences as they were set on repeating his search for gold and silver mines, they might have been rewarded by finding some of the straggling bones of his broken-down Andalusian cavalry. The fragments of broken arms and trappings were yet, perhaps, concealed by the accumulated rank vegetable soil of Arkansas and southern Missouri, whence the plow may at no distant day reveal them. It was 10 o'clock on the morning of the 19th when, having made every necessary preparation, we left Mr. Bean's. I regretted the necessity of making a selection from my collection of minerals and geological specimens. We set out with great alacrity. For the first 5 miles we passed over a level, fertile tract with several plantations. The remaining 13 miles were comparatively sterile and uneven, without settlements. We had passed about 17 miles of the distance when my right foot and ankle began to flinch. I was not sensible of any slip or sprain in walking, but rather believe it resulted from too much ardor and anxiety to get forward. I had, about 4 years previously, dislocated and injured the same ankle, in leaping down a precipice in the Green Mountains, having mistaken a granitical shelf of rock at its base, which was covered with autumnal leaves, for soft soil. I believe the suddenness and alacrity of this day's travel, after leaving the quietude of the canoe, had awakened a sympathy in the injured nerves. In a short time the pain was unendurable. With great effort I walked a mile further and reached a double-log house, the mistress of which bathed the ankle with salt and water and made other applications. Some alleviation, but no permanent relief, was obtained. I then laid down under the hope of being better, but awoke on the morning of the 20th with little or no abatement of the pain and inflammation. A traveler on horseback coming along that morning on a fine animal agreed, for small compensation, to let me ride to the South Fork of Strawberry River while he went afoot. This helped me over 12 miles of the road where his path diverged, and I felt so much relieved by it on dismounting that I managed by easy stages to walk 4 miles farther, which brought us to the main river. The afternoon was not yet spent, but the pain of my ankle had returned before reaching the river, and I found it in vain to press forward, without adequate repose. The next morning, the 21st, my traveling companion, who cared nothing for natural history or antiquities, and was urgent to push on, left me and returned to St. Louis. Left alone, I felt for a few moments a sense of isolation, but I was now in a region where there was no longer any danger to be apprehended for the want of the first necessities of life. My lameness required nothing, indeed, but perfect repose. The people were kind, and when I ascertained that my hostess was a sister of one of the hunters who had guided me in the most remote parts of my wanderings in the Ozarks, there was a manifest point of sympathy. I found by inquiry that there were appearances of a mineral deposit in this vicinity, which seemed to connect the hilly grounds of Strawberry River with similar indications which have been noticed near the Bull Shoals on White River. Appearances denote the existence of a sulphuret of lead in the vicinity. The sulfate of barytes, calcareous spar, and white crystalline masses of quartz characterize the uplands. When my foot and ankle would bear it, I proceeded by easy paces northward, going, the first day after leaving the Strawberry Valley, 10 miles, which brought me to a place called Dogwood Springs, so named from the Cornus Florida. The next day I went 10 miles further, when I came to the banks of Spring River, where I was entertained by Major Haynes. Here I first saw cotton in the fields, being the unpulled bolls of the autumn crop, which had not been thought worth gathering. Feeling no injury to result from these easy marches, which gave me time to examine the appearances of the surface, I ventured a little farther on the recovery of my ankle, and the third day went 19 miles. In this distance I crossed a stream called 11 Points, a tributary to Spring River, and came at a rather late hour in the evening into a small valley called Fouché de Mar, a popular corruption of the French Fourche Thomas. It was quite dark when I applied for a night's lodging at a small cabin, being the only one I had encountered for many miles. The man and his wife, who were its only occupants, were manifestly not blessed with much of this world's goods, but they were kind, and though they had already gone to bed and had but one room, they permitted me to occupy a part of the floor. Spare bed they had none, but had they possessed ever so many, I did not require one. Camping out under the open heavens so long had created a habit which made it impossible for me to rest in a soft bed. I had declined one the night before at Spring River, and thrown myself on a single blanket on the hard puncheons. I wished to keep my nerves up to this tense state and the hardy habits of the woodman, while I was compelled to foot my way and take my chances for a rough fare for some time. With the earliest gleams of light, I was up and walked 4 miles to breakfast. 12 more brought me to Hicks Ferry on a large stream called the Currents. I had camped on the source of this river and the cliffs of the Ozarks on my outward trip, and found the region remarkable for its large saltpeter caves. It was here a river 8 feet deep and 300 yards wide. At this spot I should have stopped, for after going beyond it I found the country was thinly settled, which compelled me to walk some time after nightfall before I could find a house. And on presenting myself, the man proved to be surly and gruff, and denied me lodging. It was evident to me from words that passed that his wife was expecting to be ill, and as the house was small, there seemed some reason for his apparent unkindness. I had already come 23 miles. The night was dark and threatened rain, and the next house distant. I should have been happy to exclaim with the poet, "Turn, gentle hermit of the dale, and guide my lonely way." But there was no gentle hermit in sight. It was clearly not a question of poetry, but was likely to be one of sober, downright prose. I said to him finally, after a look into the black darkness and desolate woods, that I would only claim my length on the floor, and to give no uneasiness to his good lady, be off at the slightest intimation. He consented, and I laid down without receiving any notice of the lady's expected illness till morning, when I left my pallet at a very early hour. Well, 3 miles beyond, it was a rough region, through which it required daylight to pass, and where I must have lost my way in the dark had I gone on the night previously. I stopped at a cottage for breakfast. It was occupied by a poor woman. Everything bore tokens of this fact. She appeared to have little in the way of eatables herself, but was very willing in the article of breakfast to share that little with me. I had passed the night before supperless after a long day's walk, and the morning's air had further excited my appetite. Still, I should have gone on had another habitation been near at hand, but what the good woman wanted in means, she made up in readiness and hearty good will. And if the meal was not sumptuous, I rose as well satisfied as if I had breakfasted with the Lord. Thus refreshed, I went on 10 miles, which brought me to the banks of Little Black River. 2 miles beyond this stream, I stopped at the house of a Mr. Reeves at an early hour in the afternoon, my ankle giving indications of returning lameness. Quiet and a night's repose had the effect to relieve these symptoms, and I was enabled, cautiously, to continue my journey the next day. Daylight was ever my signal for rising, and by easy stages I made 17 miles during the day, walking early and late. The first 6 miles of this distance were made before I stopped for breakfast, and the next 10 miles brought me to the ferry over Big Black River, a clear, rapid stream which, in its progress to the south, is the recipient of all the before-mentioned streams from the Strawberry River north, and is itself, finally, a tributary of White River, maintaining through it a free navigation with the Mississippi. After crossing the ferry, I went about half a mile further, and took up my night's lodgings at a Mr. Bollinger's. I felt no further weakness of my foot and ankle, and was happy in the reflection that my cautious movements had been such as not to overtax the strength of my nerves. Indeed, from this point till 1830, I experienced no further symptoms of lameness. On the next morning, 28th, I walked 7 miles and took breakfast at a Mr. Estes, where I fell in with the old road which had originally been laid when the country came to be settled on the ancient Indian path. The elevated lands between Black River and the St. Francis had evidently been the line of march of De Soto when, in 1541, he set forward from Quigwait on the St. Francis toward the northwest in search of Caligoa. Any other course between west and southwest would have involved his army in the lagoons and deep and wide channel of Black River, which forms a barrier for about 150 miles toward the south. While this dividing ground between the Black River and St. Francis consists chiefly of dry pine lands and open uplands, offering every facility for the movements of his cavalry, which were ever the dread of the Indians.